کشوری هستم که محدودیت آینده ما بسازم.
When we see something that we really want to fix and a challenge that we really want to overcome, we actually do pull together.
मेरा फ्यूचर बहुत ब्राइट है.
Tu dois te battre et réussir dans la vie.
अंडर एस्टिमेट कभी नहीं करना चाहिए.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Economic Times CEO Roundtable in partnership with Deloitte. Our esteemed panel will discuss India's decade, can the country deliver on its promise? Arijit Barman, Associate Editor, The Economic Times, will moderate the discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Gaurav, and a very good evening to the panel and, of course, the guests. You know, for the Romans, the god of beginnings, on whom the month of January is named after, is two-faced. And that's for a reason. Rarely has Janus's view become more important as it is today. As ET's columnist T.K. Arun puts it, a clear vision of 2022 is essential to clear the mist of 2023. We are hosting the G20. We have its Sherpa amongst us as well, Mr. Amitav Kant. So we ask, can we leverage the global flux to our advantage? If it is indeed India's decade, can the country deliver on its promise? Now, since we have a football team, almost like the Paris Saint-Germain or the Man City lineup, sorry, Mr. Damodaran, I know you're an ardent football fan and a Liverpool fan, but I had to rub this in. Some house rules. It's a long panel. We have lots of grounds to cover. We'll keep our answers short so that, and make it more interactive so that, you know, everyone can participate. Mr. Kant, I want to come straight to you and, you know, start off by asking about the demographic dividend that we keep talking about. Now, India's median age is 28. It's 38 for China. So technically half the country, that is close to 70 crore, are eligible young people. They need to subsist, survive, and do better. Now, their survival instincts alone will create enough momentum for the GDP to grow. But is it anywhere close to whatever is the true potential?
You know, the best route for this to benefit from the demographic dividend is to grow at high rates. We're growing at about 7%, which is the fastest amongst large countries of the world. But we need to be even more ambitious. India needs to grow at about 9 to 10% per annum year after year for 3 decades or more. Many countries of the world have done this in the past. And this can only happen on the back of 2-3 things. First is, like we've demonstrated, the huge digital transformation that India has done. We do 11x more payment than what US and Europe do together. We do 3.5x more than what China does. We need to do the same thing for going green, because going green is going to attract value, it's going to attract capital. And India is climatically blessed, that's important. And the other thing is to really drive capex expenditure. This is really going to be the key. The higher the growth, the greater your per capita income. Important thing is that you may be $3 trillion, you may be the fastest growing large economy, but your per capita incomes are still just $2,100. We need to take that to $15,000 for every single Indian individual. That's when the real prosperity for the demographic dividend will take place.
Ms. Bhattacharya, it's tough to put you in a bracket. You've been a banker, now leading a cloud-based software company. You're on the board several companies, including Reliance. The demographic dividend, or the young and the restless that we keep talking about, how can technologies, how can artificial intelligence tackle or help harness this restless energy?
So first and foremost, I must say that, you know, it's lovely bridging between finance and IT. these are the two major pillars of any economy, and I am really grateful and fortunate that I have been able to do that. Let me tell you that we really call this India's decade. That's the term NASSCOM uses, and even the government is using that, because it is actually technology that's going to help us solve this enormous problem, which cannot be solved in any other way.
Correct.
If you look at, for instance, the financial inclusion piece that we started at the public sector banks, and subsequent riding on that, the way we have been able to leverage the India stack based on Aadhaar, based on the bank accounts that were opened, it shows that technology can take care of problems which cannot be taken care of in any other manner. Not only that, the fact of the matter is, if you're looking at technology skills across the world, India, in a survey done by our own company, that's Salesforce, it shows that we have the most digitally aware population of any country. And the strange part is that we are #1 country of people above 80 who are enabling themselves digitally, above 80, mind you. So, it's quite strange to see the way India has evolved as a digitally aware country. Having said that, I don't think industry is up to speed. There is still, industry in India still is in the laggard quadrant. But if you're looking at the population, it isn't. The only thing I think that, we can really deliver over here and really unleash the power of demography, as you're calling it, is by ensuring the right kind of skilling. I think there is a gap there, and that's where we really need to work.
Mr. Subramanian, you've been inside the government and now at IMF. I want to ask you this, that we are talking at one end of subsidizing semiconductors when, as per our own Education Ministry's assessment, dropout rates at the primary level have doubled. Are we somewhat missing the wood for the trees?
First of all, let me thank Economic Times for inviting me to be part of this extremely esteemed panel. So I'll quickly answer that question, but I think one important point when we look into the decade is that today, in an environment where all the advanced economies are having 2.5 to 4 times inflation, along with recession or maybe very, very low growth, India registering 7% growth, together with inflation that is 70% of its historical average, is I think something we have to first note. At least in my time period, I haven't ever seen India being an outlier on both counts. So that's the first thing to. Now, when it comes to the way I would frame your question is about, on the one hand, manufacturing, which is basically PLI is an enabler on that manufacturing sector growth, versus human capital. I think both are extremely important. Human capital for the service sector. Manufacturing, you talked about the demographic dividend. And I think if we really need to be providing jobs for all the youth that we have, we do need manufacturing sector. For instance, many of us maybe live in gated communities. The people who come and do housekeeping, these folks could actually be going and working in a factory nearby, have a permanent job, and therefore, earn very well, and not suffer volatility of income. And as Milton Friedman said, the permanent, the permanent income hypothesis, that really builds up consumption. And, boon boon se sagar bharta hai. So, it will actually be important for macro as well, creating jobs. And therefore, the PLI scheme, I wouldn't position it the way you did it, which is as a trade-off. I think we have to certainly enable manufacturing sector growth. And I think now, if you look at the numbers, it is, good growing, but there's plenty of potential to move on this. And we need to focus there on removing all the, the 5 elements, each of which actually add to cost, which is capital, labor, logistics, power, and the economies of scale, and really make it competitive for our firms. PLI is something that is actually a stopgap that is enabling it, but eventually these have to be really enabled. And at the same time, on the human capital, I think education and healthcare, the digitization that is happening, I think will really enable that. That is what will, enable a lot of service sector growth, because when manufacturing grows, services will also follow. And so I wouldn't frame this as an either or, it is an and.
Right. Mr. Bikshadari, everyone knows you to be the man who creates unicorns, but many don't know this about you, that you're also part of the Ashoka University. So I have another question vis-a-vis education and human capital. And again, let me throw some data at you. Just last week we came out with the ASER report. It talks about enrollment is going up, but private tuitions are also equally going up. Nationally, children's reading ability has dropped to pre-2012 levels, reversing the slow improvement achieved in the intervening years. It says drops are visible in both government and private schools in most states and for both boys and girls. Now, being involved in the education sector, would you say that we are missing out on a golden opportunity not just for India but also for the world? We need to invest and focus much more on human capital than what we are doing now.
No, we do need to invest much more, but I think what we are seeing right now, the regression is perhaps an impact of 2 years of COVID, where people could not go to school and therefore had to study at home, and that wasn't the same thing, right? Where will we be 5 years from now? That's the question. And I think that's what governments, and not just the central government, education is a state subject, state governments need to focus on.
Yeah.
And I think there is enough cognizance, at least if you look at the new education policy of the central government, there's enough cognizance of the importance of human capital in education. And I think the NEP is a step forward.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Damodaran, would I be wrong to say that the two fundamental ingredients for economic development, and we can go back to 300 years, that no country has actually grown without education and, secondly, increased participation of women in the workforce?
There's absolutely no doubt that you need increased participation of women in the workforce. I think we haven't done enough. Mm-hmm. I believe in the next few years we will do much more than we've done in the past several years. Education is important, healthcare is important. What is most important is what we have neglected for a very long time, which is skill development. You use the expression demographic dividend. It will be a dividend only if you can skill that part of the population, otherwise it will be a liability. So skilling ought to be given very high priority. If that doesn't happen, nothing else. One last thing we need to do, I know I might be stealing from Hargreaves' book, we need to make our legal systems far, far simpler than they are at this point of time. Now we are all trapped in the process. We will never get to see justice at the end of it. Correct. Unless we discard these outdated processes.
Now we have two very prominent women professionals on the panel, and I have to ask them, Ms. Bhattacharya, once again, to you, while diversity seems to be a board agenda, but it seems that the Indian boards themselves do not have enough women board members. Is it that difficult to get top women leaders to populate our boards? Privately, CEOs would say, kya kare, we don't have enough. Is that a fact?
It is absolutely not a fact. And in fact, I have recommended various very capable ladies to boards, and very often the leaders of the boards, the chairman of the boards, have come back and told me that these are not C-suite people. They may be just below the C-suite, and all the rest of my board members are C-suite people. And therefore, either the women may feel out of place or the other board members may not be accepting of it. Now, the fact of the matter remains that, it is the truth that there are not that many women in the C-suites. Does that mean that till they get to the C-suites, they don't get a seat on the board? I have known, for instance, one lady of a similar sort, and I somehow or the other managed to convince this conglomerate to put her on one of the boards. Today I know that she is on 3 of those boards of their companies. Because when I asked them how come this happened, when you were so resistant about her coming on one board, he said that, she's the best prepared and brings the best inputs into the board, because of which now we have put her in 3 boards. Now the fact of the matter is we have to get past this mentality. Today there are various initiatives being taken by various non-governmental agencies to actually prepare women for boards. But the current board members need to have that openness to be able to accept non-C-suite, ex-C-suite people into their boards in order to improve that number. It is not difficult to come by extremely competent women for boards.
Correct. Peter, it's not just the board or the C-suites. The participation of women in the workforce in India is very low. It's gone down post-pandemic even more. And so how do we get them back to the offices? And if you have, what are your top 3 points?
So one, on the board, I have to say that in our company, even if you exclude 4 of us who are on the board, we have 2 very competent independent lady members, and all of us are on board. So I think people are available, number one. Getting women back to the workplace has been a challenge, because I think women have also understood that they can really work from home. And do very well and be productive. So I think policy from a company is that if you physically don't need them there, we might have to rethink ourselves. We might have to reinvent and say that maybe work from home or work different hours. So we have to be flexible and a bit forward thinking in that space. So when for women working, we should not, women or men for that matter, it is, can you get a job done? Can you do it efficiently? And can it be cost effective? And if it ticks all 3 boxes, I think the geography or the physical place should not matter that much.
Do lawyers need to come to work?
A lot of them advise long distance over Zoom calls.
Correct.
So I don't know.
What about, do lawyers need to come to work? Or
so many of the lawyers actually can work digitally.
Right.
And if the courts have also gone digital, obviously, it becomes very easy. So
sure.
I just want to make a factual correction here. I think what you quoted on the decline in the female labor force is from the CMI data. And I think there's been a lot of debate. I've written about this as well. It is unreliable, noisy. If you look at the official PLFS data that is put up by NSSO, I think the facts are actually different. So just a factual correction on the macro numbers.
I just want to lay one point here, that during COVID, it was the women workforce who were your frontline workers. Yeah. So they were actually there battling in the front line. So you need to give them credit.
Absolutely.
For that too.
Also for lawyers, I'd add that what COVID has done has gotten more women back to the lawyers' workforce, because they can actually work from home and be as effective and productive.
True.
Also, I think one thing we need to make sure is that many rural women who are actually part of this SHGs and are generating quite a bit of income for their families, they identify themselves as homemakers. They don't identify themselves as working women. So I think, that nomenclature also needs to be clarified before we really say that there is a fall in the women in our labor forces.
You wanted to add something?
When you talk in terms of the number of women on boards, the real problem is no one is looking hard enough. The universe on which they focus is existing women directors. Outside that number of existing women directors, there are a whole lot of other people who are fit. But if you don't look in that direction, you'll never find them.
Right.
Before you move away from women, I thought I would probably make a point. And I'm always nervous talking statistics in front of Mr. Kant, so you'll forgive me if I say there are 400 million women, 400 million who are below the age of 30, 50% women. Even if you say you get 100 million women in the workforce, we've done our jobs.
Yeah.
And you're looking at a period of growth for the economy. In a period of growth, you will have a lot more employment, and each one of us as organizations has to make sure that you at least take 50% into the workforce. That's what we do as an organization. We've been extremely successful, married with technology, which we spoke about. And again, if you look at skilling, look again in terms of the intersection with technology. I think we are at that cusp where we, as India, can set the path for the rest of the world. I know, Mr. Kant, you're doing it in the B20 as well, in terms of how we bring the diversity on the agenda there. And I'm very, very confident that we should look at this positively. And as regards the boards, with all due respect, As a working man of so many years, I can say this, that boards are more for governance. I don't think we should say that the highlight of one's career is only being on a board. There are many other positions of leadership that one can enjoy in organizations, and many organizations do give women those positions in leadership. So let's not benchmark success with only being on a board. There are many, many other ways in which one can be successful.
Sure, sure.
Arijit, if I can step in on the board's issue, it's not really the women issue, it's the board issue. The quality of boards in India is not good at all. The board is a source of competitive advantage, and unless managements improve the quality of the way board functioning, it will have a huge impact. And the boards have to play a very, very important role, not only in ESG part, but the strategy part, the culture part, the purpose of the organization. And I think that's where we need to improve substantially.
What's the story in Serum, Adar?
Which story would you like to know?
In terms of women, in terms of women on the in the factories.
Well, that's a very interesting point. Certain sectors are very suited, of course, for women, including their interest in joining that sector. Now, take for example manufacturing, working 8-10 hours in a grueling condition in the heat without breaks. You know, some women choose, you know, a more creative role or want to work in marketing or design.
Sure.
For a manufacturing sector particularly, where you've got to, you know, do packaging or stand on an assembly line, it's particularly difficult to encourage and get women to be in that place. But we've actually made a lot of strides to bring women in and stop this working from home. And I know there's a lot of diverse views on it. I hope a lot of my competitors encourage working from home, because then I'll become a monopoly. Because, you know, this notion of working from home, yes, during COVID was fine. In certain areas, it's okay. But I mean, how can you really work from home? Your children will come running through the door on a Zoom call and interrupt, or something screaming. It looks very unprofessional. And, you know, you want to be able to be creative. You want to be able to interact with your colleagues at work. Now, how can you do that from home? That took away, this was a very important part. A lot of ideas, creativity, personal interrelations between executives, employees, mid-level, that happens in the workplace, at the canteen, lunch break, even just when you've got some idle time. You can't do that sitting at home. So I think that's very important, that, you know, you work from home when you have to, especially if women, for example, need to take time off to take care of their family or go on maternity leave. Yes, it's a very good alternative to continue working from home. Back in the day, that, you know, you'd have an 8-month gap in your career because of that. So those sort of areas, yes, it makes sense. But we have a very different culture of, you know, coming to work and, you know, building on creativity and relationships, and the culture of a company is very important. You can't do that online. You can't do it from home.
We are talking about breaking one orthodoxy. The other orthodoxy that dominated the headlines in 2022 was the return of political orthodoxy from Brazil to Chile, Colombia, Egypt, and we saw markets, very sharp market sell-offs in each of these countries, where there were high external debt, government deficits were higher, and there were unorthodox leaders. Now it's budget season, so Mr. Subramanian, I wanted to ask you that the price of money has changed, and tight money is not a temporary phenomena anymore. The new standard for inflation is closer to 4% than 2%. So interest rates won't be falling back to zero. This, many would argue, is a paradigm shift. We haven't seen this in a long, long time. Should India, therefore, be leveraging low growth, which would also lead to low commodity prices? And isn't this the time to break away from the shackles of fiscal deficit targets and use domestic borrowings to invest in physical and social infrastructure to spur domestic consumption and growth?
Absolutely. You would recall that the 2020-21 economic survey that we had written, in that there was a chapter that debt sustainability is all about the difference between the nominal rate of borrowing and the nominal rate of growth.
Yeah.
And if we, take this year for instance, the nominal rate of growth is 15.4%. if you take the 10-year borrowing, it's about 7.3%. Even looking forward over the next 10 years, quite likely India should be able to grow nominally at between 11 to 12% at least. And if the bond index inclusion and other things happen, the cost of borrowing should be 7% or maybe lower.
Correct.
So the difference is clearly 5%, and therefore, rather than going by norms that actually have no grounds in economics, things like the Maastricht Treaty, which said that 3% fiscal deficit and 66% debt to GDP. By the way, I must mention to the viewers that the Maastricht Treaty is not an economic document, it was a political document to bring the EU together. So rather than go by that, I think we have to think for ourselves, and clearly I completely agree, but it should not be for revenue expenditure. It should be for capital expenditure, as has been done in the last 3-4 years, because capital expenditure essentially creates assets. And when you have assets in the economy, supply increases. That also means that you don't have as much inflation. I'm all for it. In fact, if you look at, in 2020, our debt to GDP ratio was in excess of 90%. And at that time, we had done the projections that the debt to GDP ratio will go down because of this growth, R minus G differential, the nominal rate of borrowing versus the nominal rate of growth. And today, if you look at 2022, it's actually about 80%, and it will continue growing down. I think that's the key point to look at. And I think the conceptual arguments have already been made, and there is political will to be able to take and do that capital expenditure. I would expand that to also go into health and education. Those are equally important, and I think outlays there. For instance, we should be targeting about 3% debt to, of GDP spending on healthcare. That's a target that we should be doing, and utilizing this should be definitely a priority.
No, correct. I do have questions on that, but Mr. Kant, are we too obsessed about rating agencies, and that's why we get trapped into this fiscal deficit debate?
First, let me put this right. India as a country needs to be fiscally responsible. There are 75 countries in the world which are facing a global debt crisis. All around you in South Asia and Southeast Asia, you're facing a major challenge of being fiscally responsible, and I think it's very important that our states all need to be fiscally responsible. It's also important to say, that the government's debt to GDP ratio is high in India, but the private debt to GDP ratio is extremely low in India. And therefore, if you compare India's private debt to GDP ratios in the 56 or 57, in America it's 256, China is 226. So what we need to do is to get the animal spirits of the private sector back to drive India's growth. Yeah. And this would require a huge technological leapfrogging. It would require them to get into completely new sunrise areas of growth. And this would really require a huge new areas of, which are going to drive India's growth story. Electric mobility, battery storage, green hydrogen, mobile manufacturing. These are the areas which are going to give you 10x more growth than the normal areas of manufacturing. And that's why the sunrise areas of growth are very, very critical for India from viewpoint of growth and job creation.
Correct. Mr. Venkataraman, what's holding India Inc. back then? I mean, this animal spirit that Mr. Kant is talking about, that, private debt should go up, capex, there should be much more capex outlays. There's still, it's improved, but still.
Oh, you're asking me?
No, I'm asking that. I'll come to you.
First, I think you're talking about capex. Yeah, capex depends on a few things. One is, of course, the capacity utilization, and there was a period when the capacity utilization was below 70%. And now it's inching up beyond 70%. The second important thing we often forget, there were a lot of dormant assets which were locked in NCLT. They are really something like 8.5 lakh crore of capex equivalent. Capacity has now been released. So you need to add that before you come to a conclusion that private capex is not happening. I don't think the animal spirits in private sector has gone down. I don't think the risk-taking ability of Indian entrepreneurs is low. At the right opportune moment, you will see the capacity building happening. We should not be building capacities which will bring down significantly your return on capital assets, because that makes you uncompetitive. So I think this is an issue which we make a lot about, but there's not much really meat in it.
I would tend to agree, because in fact I was going to bring out the point of, even if you look at, say, the bankruptcy courts and the number of brownfield assets which have been purchased, it's a pretty staggering amount. But today I think the inflection point is, how do we bring more investment in? And from a company perspective, from what we see, I think everybody has their investment plans in place. I really think that I'm not at all concerned about whether investment will happen. It's just a question of timing. The problem on timing that we faced in the past was because of the pandemic, and people did slow down. I agree completely with Mr. Khan that we should look at the new sunrise areas, but then again you've got to look at gestation period. I mean, in addition to what he said, we can also add space in terms of what is happening, whether it's on the space, drone, satellite, all those areas as well. We have to look at the potential of 5G and the tremendous potential you have in terms of the, again, 5G and technology and what it will do. Look at financial inclusion. Look at the fact that it is not very far away that India will manufacture $100 phones. In fact, I think our own research says that we can come up with a $99 smartphone. These are all things that we talk a lot about, but somebody's got to put their hand up and say, I want to make the investment. So I'll just leave it with another point, maybe related, but not really, core to what you are asking me. And that is the question of trust. We should not forget that India has built a lot of trust over the last few years. We have become far more credible than what we were perceived to be. We have also been good ambassadors, whether it's on technology, not only for the ubiquity of technology, but also sharing it with the rest of the world. We also shared, our pharma with the rest of the world. We have become much more credible in terms of legislation, while I do defer to the point on courts that Mr. Damodaran made. But certainly, if I look at the decriminalization of laws that has taken place, the intent of the government to say that we will make it easier for you to do business, these are all cumulative factors that have now built up to a stage where now the inflection point is get the investment in. So I certainly think the conversation now is to move more into how do we get more money in for business. And maybe Mrs. Bhattacharya could give us the answers on that one. Certainly the banks have loosened on credit. If I look at all the new developments, whether it's OCN and the like, they will help them MSME businesses. There's a lot happening. The question is, how do we stitch it all together?
True. Ms. Bhattacharya, I wanted to ask you, the balance sheets of India Inc. have improved a lot, no doubt. There's been, it's been cathartic. But on the other side, post-IBC, the way assets are going, and I'll ask Hargiv's opinion also on this, some might say it's also leading to concentration of powers within just a few business groups. It's not spreading. Is that part of capitalism, or there's something more deeper here?
No, I don't really think that, what you are saying is that we are becoming a monopolistic kind of society. I don't really...
Not a monopoly, that's too extreme, but maybe a duopoly or an oligopoly.
Power, see, the fact of the matter is that at certain times there might be concentration in certain areas, but you will see competition come up. If you see the number of startups that are coming up every day, if you look at the kind of solutions that are really disintermediating the legacy industries, if you look at all of that, I don't think concentration in any industry is going to last long in any hands, because better solutions will come up, better possible, different ways of doing the same things might come into being, and therefore I don't think we need to worry too much about things getting concentrated in a few hands, because there is sufficient amount of entrepreneurship in the country, which again gives me a lot of hope. You've seen the number of people that are getting employed by the startups, and this is across the board. It is not only, in Bangalore and Noida and Pune that.
But they're also losing jobs by the dozens.
Pardon?
But they're also losing jobs by the thousands.
It doesn't matter, because those things, every company goes through reshaping, reorganization, and every time they go through that, they actually work out stronger. The fact of the matter is people might be getting laid off, but they're also getting recruited at the same time. So you've got to look at both sides of it. And I don't think we should start getting nervous because there are layoffs. Layoffs will happen. Certain organizations may have hired more than they bargained for because they had thought that things would be better or growth would be more in that particular industry. Didn't happen. So they lay off. But there are other industries that are willing to take them on. So I think, it's a very dynamic kind of a situation. Believe me, India will be the talent basket of the world. There is no two ways about it. In the next decade, 25% of the skills required globally will come from India. That's the way it is, just out of sheer demographics. Because the world is growing younger, whereas, we ourselves are still, we have 67% of our population in the working age space.
We are getting, sorry, please.
No, I'm very optimistic about this actually. I see it across the world.
So we are getting younger, certainly we are also consuming more, and that's where both Marico and HUL sit right at the heart of the consumption story. Mr. Mehta, after your December numbers, I was seeing one of your interviews and you said rural markets are showing some signs of improvement on easing inflation and robust sowing of winter crops and increase in farm incomes. If there is real income growth happening in rural India, what should we do to sustain this? Because between 2008 and 14, we actually saw real-term wage growth in rural India.
First I think the important bit is that it is not that the headline growth is not happening in rural area. It is there, albeit at a much lower level than what we would all like it to be. The second is the inflation in commodities has been unprecedented. When in a business like ours, you have a net material inflation of over 20%. This is not something I've seen in my 30-year career with Unilever. So this is unprecedented. And despite this increase, the industry has taken a price increase of about 12%. The consumers in rural are still spending more. Understandably, they've cut back on volumes to manage their wallets, which is again very intuitive. I believe that once the commodity prices start tapering, the volumes will also come back. And the rural per capita consumption is 1/3 of that of urban area. So if you look at the trend, rural consumption should be growing faster than urban for years to come. It's at a very low base today. And India's per capita of FMCG is about $45, which when you compare, forget with developing countries, is, say, Indonesia is 2x, Philippines is 4x. So just look at the runway to grow. What India needs is inclusive growth, more money in the hands of more people, and the consumption story of India will be the consumption story of the world, not just for the decade, for decade and beyond.
Mr. Mariwala, but intuitively people would argue that you need to move to cities, urban centers for real income to see a rise in your personal real income. That needs rapid urbanization. Our cities are choking. We both come from a city where 60% of the urban poor live in slums. How can we deal with this of actually creating more sustainable, energy efficient urban centers?
I'm not an expert on this, but let me just say that when urbanization happens, consumption levels go up clearly. There is a conversion from unbranded to branded and going up the value chain. So clearly, urbanization is adding to purchasing power, that's for sure. It's adding to wealth. Now, you're talking of a subject of urban planning and cities.
I'm just asking, can our existing towns cope?
I think they are getting choked. We need many, many more towns. And I think many towns are emerging also. But they have to emerge in the right way in terms of environment, in terms of urban planning. So we have some way to go. But I think we are seeing emergence of smaller towns, which is a good sign.
Here, the other important aspect is a social aspect. Social cohesion. That becomes important. I mean, Sri Lanka did wonders on all social indicators for over a decade, and then there was civil unrest and lost a decade of growth. Can a country really prosper if social tensions prevail?
No, you're absolutely right. I think the quality of life that everyone experiences is very important. If that is not addressed, whether it's peace of mind, happiness, security, any of those attributes, then of course economic growth and the economy can't grow either. So I think what we're doing in our country is very important, and the change and reforms that are coming about even socially. But I think corporates can also do a lot more when it comes to the environment, skill building, training. For example, we process half of Pune's waste, and hundreds of tons of waste is picked up and taken out of the city. We're doing something in plastic, etc. as well. But I think you're absolutely right. Economic growth is of no value, and there's no point in doing it if the quality of life, and where there's gender equality, social equality, financial equality, inclusion, all that is taken into account. It's very important.
Mr. Mariwala, you're passionate about plastics and reusability, and others talking about the same. Mr. Mehta is here. Is the FMCG industry ready to recycle plastics and address a very critical aspect of climate change?
So you're absolutely right. 60% of plastics, I think, are used by FMCG industry, and we can be accused of harming the environment. But the problem is actually, as Adar was saying, the recyclability and creating the circular economy, which is important. How the waste is collected, how it is sorted out. And I've talked to you, Arjit, earlier that we have come out with a report, and if I can speak a little bit about it, it's a report on actually how to recycle, reuse and replace plastics. And this is just released, and we have identified 14 innovators who have done phenomenal work in this. If actually the whole civil society, the government, the private sector, if we pay attention to this, this can improve substantially.
But the two of the biggest FMCG players are on this panel.
But no, Arijit, for that you need to have the right way of collecting waste, the right way of sorting out, because we can reuse plastics, but the quality of waste we get is not reusable. So actually it starts with the way the waste is disposed to, the way the waste is sorted out, and then it's recycled and brought it back to us. And that time we can, I'm sure Sanjeev, and I'm seeing Suresh also from Nestle, so I'm sure we'll be more open to using plastics.
Sorry.
We have been collecting more plastic from the streets of India than we use in our packaging material. That's about 125,000 tons. So just to give you a perspective, हमारे देश में newspaper की रद्दी कभी litter नहीं होती है, because you have got an economic model around it. Our job as manufacturers is to ensure that our plastic is recyclable, reusable or compostable. Then we have to, together with the civic administration, which we are doing. If you come to D Ward in Mumbai, I think we have got a classic example of how we can crack it. And we have to create an ecosystem whereby the plastic remains outside the environment but within the loop of the business. Yeah, plastic has become, unfortunately, public enemy number one. But that's a wrong thing, because without plastics, neither our planes would fly nor our healthcare would be taken care of. Yeah, our job is to sort, not letting it remain in the environment.
Correct. Preeta, we're talking about healthcare. A lot has been talked or debated about, how instead of a curative hospital-based healthcare model, we should be ideally focusing on preventive and more holistic approach towards healthcare for optimal results. What are companies like Apollo, leading private sector players, doing to make healthcare affordable for the wider mass?
So there are two things. One is about affordability, and we have to understand the fact that healthcare in India, whatever we do, we're still doing it at 1/10 the cost. We're importing equipment, consumables. It's only the manpower and infrastructure costs. So there is a cost to input and there's a cost to quality. But that does not say that, we can get away from it. And one of the biggest answers to that problem is insurance. And I think a lot of states have their own state insurance, which is doing very well. PMJ is picking up momentum, and I think that's a phenomenal move. And a lot of healthcare private insurers, even in the Western economies, it is the insurer who's paying for healthcare. It's very expensive, but people are insured. So I think it's a culture shift and makes it more accessible to people. So I think that is definitely one answer. The other is that however much we build, healthcare infrastructure, it's not going to be enough unless we take care of the problem of the non-communicable diseases. COVID taught us a huge lesson, but we must remember that whether it's cancer, diabetes, heart issues, it's still a big problem. So within our organization, we have said that the whole focus is to keep people out of hospitals. And I think that all healthcare providers, whether it's public sector, private sector, the focus has to be shifted. We've shown the world that we can do the best in class of healthcare interventions. But I think the focus must now change in keeping people out of hospitalization, which means keep them well, communicate about better lifestyles, better eating habits, exercise. Our ancestors were so much more healthy than we are. So I think that is our biggest responsibility.
Do we invest as a country enough on frontier technologies, biotech, vaccines? Because vaccines became a tool of diplomacy over the last 2 years. Everyone lauded you and your company and your efforts. But do we do enough when it comes to actual R&D in biotech, which is...
We can be doing a lot more, in fact, over there. Look, the government has announced very good PLI schemes also. But I think beyond that, it's the reforms really in the permissions and licenses that reduce the duration of being able to develop a vaccine or a new drug, and also the costs that go along with it. Now in COVID, in the COVID times, we did it in 1 year.
Right.
Today, I recently launched in the morning the HPV vaccine, the first cervical cancer vaccine made in India, but that took us 5 to 6 years to develop. So, the funding is limited. Again, the investors today and the money and the capital usually goes to the disruptors, the entrepreneurs. But that capital rarely comes over to the pharmaceutical sector. I think we can do more as a sector. And of course, the government is playing a very critical role in this and is very, how would I put it, attentive and realizes the power of what this industry can grow into, and mainly, most importantly, innovate. The Indian pharmaceutical industry up till today is mainly focused on manufacturing. But now with self-reliance, take for example the vaccine industry hardly depends on imports from China. The pharmaceutical industry now needs to follow that route and make its raw materials and supply chain in India as well to be truly self-reliant.
True.
So I think capital in supply chains, raw material and innovation has to happen. It's on its way, and this entire ecosystem that we have to build to become self-reliant, I think will take another 3 to 5 years. But we're going to see a paradigm shift in what was happening traditionally. The pandemic has accelerated this industry into making these investments and decisions, and the government has been very supportive, and so I think you're going to see a major change in the next 3 to 5 years.
I'm going to do a segue here and ask Hargreaves, you've been sitting here patiently. And one other aspect that I want to discuss or talk about is the fact that, the India story is great, but at the same time, several MNCs are actually exiting India. We saw Holcim, one of the largest cement or building materials company, exit. A German retailer exited. As per some data, there are around 2,800 odd MNCs who have exited since 2012. Is that a worrying trend, or this is par for the course?
I would say that, look, you have to really go behind and see why they are exiting. And to my knowledge, I think they're not exiting for India reasons. And they're exiting for global reasons, global strategy, or their own sort of maybe problems around the world, not in relation to India. And a lot of them which are exiting are really coming back in a different way. So, for example, you know, if you mentioned some names, you'd already see them back in some other capacity. They might be also exiting because they're exiting a certain type of business, a polluting business, for example. So I don't think it's an India, reflection on India. I think it's the reverse, where I see far many more investors looking back at India. And I don't think this should be really the yardstick to see that MNCs are running away from India.
One aspect that keeps recurring when we talk to MNC CEOs is the fact that they complain that the most pedigreed Indian corporate, even if they have an arbitration clause in dispute settlement, if they lose, they will say that this arbitration order is not recognized in India. Again, it gets into Tariq pe Tariq, one court, NCLT, then Supreme Court. It just drags on. And we've seen this far too many times.
Well, this is truly unfortunate. And in spite of, several amendments at several occasions having been made to our law, giving finality to arbitration awards and recognizing international awards as being final and binding, I think that there's been some sort of interpretational loophole by which awards have been challenged. But I think the government is very cognizant of this. And the good part is that every time a loophole like this is identified, there is an amendment which is proposed to fix it. Right. So I think the Law Commission is already aware, is looking at it to see how the judicial process can be made more efficient.
Mr. Damodaran, I wanted to ask you about minority investors, but before I do that, I wanted to ask Mr. Mehta a question. The companies are globalizing, and probably that's why there's a lot of change in strategies that are happening. And global companies are shifting their R&D bases, many of them to India. Therefore, do you think royalties are or will be needed to justify going ahead?
You have to understand the business models. The first important bit is India should be open in a manner that we can access the best possible R&D and technology. We have to go up the innovation ladder. Let's accept that. Now, there are some business models where you set up an R&D center like we have, where we have 700 scientists, 200 PhDs, working on cutting-edge research, where we do not absorb the cost. The cost is absorbed by the center. So it comes back to us as technology fees. There's nothing wrong in it.
Okay.
So we have to, before we come and jump to a conclusion that royalty is good or bad or not in the interest, I think we should understand what the details of the transaction is rather than coming to a conclusion based on just hearsay.
Okay. But from a minority shareholder point of view, Mr. Damodaran, companies are increasingly becoming more homegrown. They're buying brands, they're localizing. So the dependence on the parent MNCs is reducing to various degrees. So many would argue that royalties are not justified because it is anti-minority shareholders.
No, I think Sanjeev explained why they exist. Because when you do business, you need to protect the interest of all your stakeholders. If you focus exclusively on minority shareholders and ignore the interests of the others, clearly you don't get the game going. You've got to balance this. What is needed for minority shareholders is more investor education so that they make informed investment decisions. If they're uncomfortable in a company, they should vote with their feet. Or make enough noise in AGMs to see that they are heard above the din of the management. If they don't do that, just sit back and hope that everything will work out. No, you got to fight your own cause. Here is where the securities regulator comes in, because even the preamble to the SEBI Act talks in terms of development of the market, regulation of the market, but most importantly, protection of the interest of investors. That is the ultimate goal. That is why securities regulators exist. Now, if your regulations are complex, If your regulations are outdated, events have overtaken you. If your regulations don't keep pace with the needs of all categories of investors, and you start looking at the interest of one set of stakeholders to the exclusion of the interest of the other set of stakeholders, clearly then you have a problem.
Mr. Bikhchandani, one sector that should have gained with China cracking down on their tech companies are our consumer internet companies. But clearly our unicorn seems to also have broken horns if you look at the last 1.5 years.
There are it's not natural that because China has cracked down on tech industry.
No, there a lot of money would flow into India and Indian VC space if China is no longer a safe place to invest.
Well, so that has happened to some extent.
Right.
Okay. Having said that, look, entrepreneurship is Darwinian. Startups are Darwinian. Many will fail, some will succeed, and we're seeing that play out now as the tech valuations, public markets have corrected in the US and now in India. So that will happen. But some will succeed, and those that will succeed will become huge. Just on that subject, I'd like to just make a point that, I began to work in 1984, my first job out of college. And if I look back to 1984 now and see Indian industrial landscape, see change. It's not been a revolution, it's been evolution. But if you look at the last 30 odd years, 35 years I've been working, a lot of the change, a lot of the buzz, a lot of the growth in employment, investment has come from industries and sectors that did not even exist in 1984 or barely existed. IT services barely existed. IT-enabled services did not exist. Internet did not exist. E-commerce did not exist. Mobile telephony did not exist. Private sector insurance did not exist. Private sector banks existed as legacy, but not the new banks. So private sector airlines did not exist. So the point is, these are all new initiatives, very often startups, first generation entrepreneurs. If you look at Infosys, giant company today, was a startup in the early 80s. HCL likewise. So I think the startups of today, some of them will be giant companies of tomorrow. And therefore, some will fail, some will die. But those that succeed will make it big. And I think one of the best things this government has done is Startup India, right? And that will pay off well over the next 20, 30, 40 years.
But do you feel that nobody is really talking about building institutions? Everybody is more focusing to be on passing the baton to the next investor who's suffering from a bigger FOMO.
वो होता है when there's abundant capital. That's the nature of markets. But the ones that will succeed and thrive will not be following that model. They'll be building real value, getting customers, getting revenue, making profit, and making things happen.
Do you feel the next evolution of the information age will generate new models which, instead of focusing on individual consumers, will apply digital tech to industry, serving, say, healthcare, biotech, manufacturing, and even Ms. Bhattacharya can chime in into that. Sanjeev, you want to start?
No, look, it will all happen. It's not either or. Both will happen. And they are already happening. We are seeing them. We have invested in the last 15 years in close to 60 or 65 startups from the company. And we are seeing all sorts of deals. We meet 1,000 startups a quarter and invest in 3 or 4. So it's happening. And it's across all sectors.
I think one of the biggest advantages that India has is the digital stack provided by the public sector, that's by the government. And on the basis of that India stack, there are so many companies that are innovating on it, and this is going to extend to healthcare, this is going to extend to education, this is going to extend to all kind of social welfare activities, and this is something that's just waiting to happen. People are already working on it. And I believe that this is a huge opportunity which no other country in the world has provided. So if you look at it that way, the two things that I'm really, really optimistic about, one is the digital stack, India digital stack, and the other is financial inclusion. Because this is what allows for financial inclusion. Financial inclusion in turn allows many more companies or many more people to leverage, their ability to actually do these startups. So that's one of the reasons why I think, we have a huge opportunity that, very few other countries can even hope to have.
Very quickly, Mr. Venkatram, the last word, the soft power of India. You said RRR, 3 words in Davos. That's the biggest export story for this year around. Are you sticking to that?
Yes, in fact, I'm wearing a tie which says the elephant can dance.
So
I certainly do believe that the pandemic gave us a lot of resilience. A lot of the other topics that we've talked about, I can even go on to other alphabets like the T's, whether it's talent, technology. But the one which I would close with, and I really highlight as the most important and critical for us today, is trust. As a nation, we've built a lot of trust. As businesses, we've built a lot of trust. And as I said, a lot of investment is required for our future growth. And to get the capital in, I think the area we need to continually work on is the India brand and trust.
On that, otherwise I should have said on that note, but since you talked about RRR, I'll say on that, Natu, thank you very much for this really engaging conversation. Time's really up. Thank you once again for being part of the ET jury and the roundtable. Thank you very much.
You were just outstanding.
Oh, thank you.